It looks like we got a good showing. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College fourth Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 21-22 academic year, Intelligence Operations and the American Presidency. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and benefactors, as well as my staff for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our Foundation members and many of you, the college has continued its innovative, cutting-edge research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education. Thank you. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its mission to deliver excellence in education and research, and remains committed to provide resources needed to advance its priorities of research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowments and endowed chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional studies. Tonight's presentation is only a sample of the scholarly work college students are immersed in during their 10-month rigorous academic program at the college, whose mission it is to educate future leaders of our nation and the world. As a matter of protocol, should you have a question come to you during the presentation, please put it in the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker in the Q&A session. We plan as many of your questions as time permits. As many of you know, pre-COVID, these presentations were typically hosted monthly during the academic year at the Naval Station Newport Officers Club, usually preceded by a 30-minute reception where guests can mingle with Naval War College Foundation staff and friends, and typically the guest speaker of the evening. However, since the spring of 2020, I can't believe how long it's been now, we've been bringing Newport lecture presentations and many others hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. An added benefit of the virtual environment is the opportunity to present, to interact with, and in some cases, reconnect many of our members and friends from across the country and around the world. We anticipate these lectures will continue via virtual platform for the foreseeable future, but look forward to coming again soon when most appropriate. Introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation. Dr. Stephen Knott is a professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Prior to accepting his position at the War College, Dr. Knott co-chaired the Presidential Oral History Program at the Miller Center of Public Affairs, University of Virginia. His books include Sanctioned, Covert Operations, and the American Presidency, Washington and Hamilton, the Alliance That Forged America, and Rush to Judgment, George W. Bush, the War on Terror and His Critics. His most recent book is The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline in Democracy and the Prospects for Renewal. He is currently working on a book on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Dr. Knott earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Assumption College and PhD from Boston in political science. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Stephen Knott.
Well, thank you, George, and thank you to your great staff, and I appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. Big fan of the Naval War College Foundation. I'm a member myself, and you guys do just tremendous work that's appreciated very much by the faculty at the War College. So I want to talk to you tonight, as George said, about intelligence operations and the American presidency. And in particular, I'd like to focus on a period of American history that is seldom examined when it comes to intelligence and covert operations. And I'm talking primarily about the United States from 1776 up through the Civil War. Most of us are very familiar with, and perhaps maybe even worked for, various modern intelligence entities. You know, the Central Intelligence Agency was created in 1947. Prior to that, the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War. But ever since that mid-20th century period, the United States has relied quite heavily on various military and civilian intelligence entities that I think most of us have some familiarity with. what I've found out in my years of teaching and in my years of research is that most Americans, or many Americans anyways, do not have a very strong understanding of just how deep this intelligence tradition persists throughout American history, going back to the American Revolution. So that's where I'm going to begin. And then I'm going to touch on some of the key early presidencies that sort of built a foundation that led to the establishment of permanent bureaucratic intelligence entities in the 20th century. And the place to start, naturally, is with George Washington, both as commander of the Continental Army, but also, of course, as our first president. During his leadership of the American forces in the Revolution, Washington relied quite heavily on intelligence operations as something of a force equalizer in terms of, allowing the Americans to have an occasional edge against the world's greatest superpower, the British military. And so Washington put a tremendous amount of effort into organizing spy rings behind the British lines. Most famous of all is one known as the Culper Ring, C-U-L-P-E-R, which operated inside New York City, which served for most of the Revolutionary War as the headquarters of the British Army in North America. And this Culper spy ring reported directly to General Washington, who was usually, for great parts of the American Revolution, headquartered out in distant parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And this spy ring, again known as the Culper Ring, did provide Washington with some very timely information derived from those individuals who had some access to the British military headquarters. Washington was so committed to intelligence operations that he actually, on occasion, dipped into his own personal finances to keep these spying operations functioning. There were many occasions where the Confederation Congress was unable to get its act together in time to provide the funding to keep these spying operations underway. And as I said, Washington literally dipped into his own purse at times to keep these spies functioning. That shows you the extent to which he was committed to an intelligence establishment during the Revolutionary War. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that these spies, helped tip the scales against the British, but they were a factor. They were one of many factors. And let me just give you one specific example of where Washington's penchant for clandestine operations paid substantial dividends. In the buildup, in the weeks and months leading to the buildup of what will become the Siege of Yorktown, Washington was very successful at convincing the British that he was planning to attack somewhere in the north, perhaps even attack the headquarters of the British Army in New York City. So there were multiple efforts, what today we would call disinformation campaigns, to convince the British that that was General Washington's intention in 1781, when in fact for months he had been planning to move south to trap General Cornwallis's army in the Virginia coastal town of Yorktown with the assistance of the French Navy. That disinformation campaign, that ability to sort of permeate the upper circles of the British military paid incredibly handsome dividends and led to what most historians would conclude was the most important victory of the American Revolution, the victory at Yorktown. Now, transitioning into the post-war era, George Washington, of course, becomes our first president. And he has learned those important lessons from the Revolutionary period, that if the United States is to survive in an international order, a competitive one with enemies, all around us in a sense, we needed, the new American government needed some capability to gather intelligence on the intentions of the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, etc. And what Washington did, President Washington now we're talking about, was ask Congress in his first State of the Union message in January 1790. President Washington asked Congress for what became widely known as funding for a Secret Service fund. The formal name was the Contingency Fund, but members of Congress in 1790 routinely referred to it as a Secret Service fund. And in this request that the president makes in his first State of the Union address, the president requested $40,000, which in 1790 was a remarkable amount of money. In today's terms, we're talking millions of dollars. And the key point I want to make to our listeners tonight is that the president requested not only a substantial amount of money, he requested an exemption from Congress in terms of having to report how that money was spent. In other words, of the $40,000 that I'm asking you to appropriate to me, I will only tell you at the end of each fiscal year that I spent, 32,000 of the 40,000, and I will offer you no details as to how that was spent. Now, I hope you can grasp the importance of that request on President Washington's part, because if there's one power, at least traditionally, Congress guards, it's the power of the purse. And here was our very first president asking for an exemption from that control of the purse, asking Congress to allow him, the president, to have the discretion to spend that money as he saw fit and not report how it was spent. And while there was some opposition to Congress in this request for a Secret Service fund, ultimately the fund was passed with the assistance of prominent members of Congress, such as James Madison from Virginia, and it became law. The Secret Service Fund would be funded by a series of American Congresses well into the 19th century. So this is where the Presidential Foundation for Control of Intelligence Operations is first erected. And I do want to just give you some examples of how Washington's successors used that Secret Service Fund, both as a tool to gather intelligence on other members of the international order, but also to occasionally conduct what today we would call covert operations. Operations designed to secretly influence the internal affairs of other nations. It could take the form of covert propaganda, bribing foreign journalists to write pro-American pieces. That was a frequent tactic. Or it can be other more perhaps heavy-handed uses of covert operations, directly bribing foreign political figures, or even in some cases, trying to overthrow foreign political leaders. And I'll give you an example of that occurred right off the bat during the administration of President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, as many of you know, becomes involved in the war with the Barbary Pirates from 1801 to 1805. So throughout the bulk of Jefferson's first term in office. And most of you who are naval officers, of course, and Marines would be familiar with the conflicts that took place in the Mediterranean between the United States Navy and the various Barbary powers. But what is not quite as well known is that President Jefferson, working through his Secretary of State, James Madison, authorized the first American effort to overthrow a foreign regime. And I'm speaking here about the King of Tripoli, one of the major powers of the Barbary Pirates. The United States got wind that there was a lot of turmoil within the court of the Barbary king in Tripoli. And one of the brothers had been exiled by the sitting king. The United States, the Jefferson administration, realized that this brother who'd been exiled was itching to get back into power. And here was a perfect opportunity to try to topple somebody who was causing the United States problems on the high seas, the Mediterranean, topple them from within by using this brother. And so sure enough, President Jefferson, Secretary of State Madison gave the green light to the American ambassador in Egypt to contact this brother and help him raise a force of mercenaries who would march on Tripoli and overthrow the king who was hostile to American interests. And sure enough, this operation takes place. There was actually a battle between the king's forces and the exiled brothers' forces. Both sides were bloodied in this encounter, but the bottom line is that this covert effort, in concert with the more traditional use of force in the Mediterranean, did lead, at least for a time, the king of Tripoli to sue for peace with the United States. Now, ultimately, he's not overthrown in a strict sense. This effort to topple him failed. But if you look at it, I think with a broader perspective, the operation succeeded in delivering on the United States' aims to apply pressure to the King of Tripoli from within. So in my view, this represents the first time an American president authorizes a covert operation to overthrow a foreign head of state. And in essence, for the most part, it worked. I want to mention just a couple of more instances from Jefferson, because of course he's a major figure in American history. He's part of the pantheon of American heroes, at least if you go to Washington, D.C., that beautiful Jefferson Memorial there. His impact both on American political thought, but also the office of the presidency is substantial. And what I want to mention to you was that Jefferson's policy towards Native Americans, towards those Indian tribes on the American frontiers, consisted of clandestine payments to Native American chiefs for purposes of bribing them to move out of the way for American expansion. I'm not here to say this was a morally appropriate thing to do. I'm just laying out the facts for you. Jefferson considered bribing Native American chiefs as a better way to deal with the problem, and I'm putting that in quotes, of the presence of Native Americans on the frontier. Bribery was cheaper than force, than conventional uses of force. Plus, it had the added benefit of preserving certain myths about how the United States operated in terms of dealing with the Native Americans. He tried to keep these payments secret. The reason we know about them today, of course, is we have all this documentation. A lot of what I'm telling you at the time, in terms of this covert policy to bribe Native American leaders, was not known at the time. And I have to say it met with some success, again in quotes, at least in terms of realizing the goal of westward expansion, which was very important to Thomas Jefferson. One other thing I'll quickly mention about Jefferson, while he's the ex-president of the United States, his good friend and his Secretary of State, James Madison, succeeds him in the Oval Office. Well, there is no Oval Office at this time, but you get the point. We get, of course, involved in the War of 1812. And when the British burned down Washington, D.C. in August of 1814, Jefferson urges President Madison to retaliate by sending American agents into London with sacks of gold for purposes of hiring arsonists to burn down St. Paul's Cathedral in London and other British landmarks. I mentioned that to you, and Madison rejected the idea, but I mentioned that to you as an example of Jefferson's proclivity he was attracted to these covert operations, again, as a cheaper way of projecting American force short of conventional uses of force. All right, a little bit more about James Madison. Just prior to and during the War of 1812, the Madison administration decided that it wanted to acquire what is today the Panhandle area of Florida and also the peninsula of Florida. At the time, they were in the hands of Spain. And Madison gave the green light, President Madison, in 1811 to send American agents into the portion of the Panhandle region, Tallahassee, etc. today, for purposes of putting enough American settlers in that region who would then rise up against their Spanish colonial masters and seek recognition from the United States, which is precisely what happened. Now, what was not known, at least publicly at the time, was that the United States had inspired this uprising. The United States denied any connection to it, but we now know that the meetings, the planning operations, etc., for this insurrection, if you will, came right out of the executive branch, right out of President Madison's office. And it's important to note, by the way, that James Madison, of course, is considered the architect of the American Constitution. And yet here he is seemingly quite comfortable with the use of these presidentially sponsored covert initiatives, of which both the rest of the world is not being told the truth. Spanish diplomats were, to be blunt, lied to about America's connection to these operations. But it's important to note that members of Congress were also not briefed on these matters. And I would even make the case that some members of Congress were even deceived about the extent to which the Madison administration was involved in these covert operations in West Florida, which succeeded. East Florida, the main peninsula that we know today, far less successful. In fact, it was an outright failure. But in both instances, the diplomatic corps in Washington, D.C. and members of Congress were deceived by the Madison administration. I want to shift gears a little bit here now and talk about efforts under the presidencies of James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, all of whom were determined to acquire the area known as Texas, which at this time in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s is part of Mexico. All three of those presidents, Monroe, Adams, and Jackson, were determined to acquire, again, this territory of Texas. And all of them, despite their differences with one another, they all shared this belief that Texas needed to be acquired and that covert means were the best way to achieve that. And so you see a policy taking place throughout this period for decades in which various American envoys are attempting to bribe Mexican officials to hand over this territory. Now, it usually took the form, as I said, of bribery, but also conventional diplomacy in which the United States offered to pay millions of dollars to acquire this region. So it was a mix of both overt diplomacy and covert action to try to achieve this goal of American foreign policy. Now, as you all know, it takes the James K. Polk administration, it takes the war with Mexico to sort of extend the boundary of Texas all the way to the Rio Grande. Texas, of course, is briefly a republic for 10 years or so. But throughout that entire time, you have a series of administrations using covert means to acquire this territory of Texas. I want to jump now quickly to, and I realize, by the way, we're covering a lot of history here. So I'm hoping you're still bearing with me. But I do want to get up to President Lincoln and the Civil War. We all know, of course, and many of you would be extremely well versed with the military aspects of the American Civil War. I think what is less understood, what is less fully appreciated, is the extent to which President Lincoln, working primarily through Secretary of State William Seward, engaged in a variety of clandestine operations designed to persuade the great powers of Europe to either remain neutral in the Civil War between North and South, or best of all, to throw in their lot with the Union cause. And it would take, I could talk to you for hours about the details of some of these operations that took place in Europe in terms of trying to sway both elite opinion, political leadership, but also public opinion in Europe to support the Union cause, or to at the very least to deny the Confederacy the recognition it sought and the weaponry it sought from, particularly from Great Britain. And so a wide net of American operatives reported to the American ambassador to Belgium, a man by the name of Henry Sanford. And Sanford's network, as I said, he had agents throughout Europe, in London, in Brussels, in Paris, in parts of Holland, scattered throughout, all of whom were well-financed out of this contingency fund that I mentioned to you earlier, but also occasionally through private donations from wealthy Northerners who were secretly contacted by the Lincoln administration to provide funds for this clandestine campaign in Europe. And well over $1 million in 1860s money was spent in this effort. And we're talking about bribing foreign journalists to write pro-union editorials or anti-slavery editorials. The slavery issue was always a tough one for the Confederacy in terms of winning European recognition. And so these Union operatives played on that anti-slavery sentiment in Europe, planted pieces in all sorts of European journals, as I said, bribed journalists, bribed political figures, and it's important to note, this network run by Henry Sanford also engaged in acts of sabotage. They made sure that Confederate blockade runners were delayed in terms of their delivery. In one case, they actually made sure that a warship that was being built by for the Confederates in Great Britain was sabotaged to the point where it was launched. It actually sank in the harbor just minutes after being launched. That kind of sabotage was frequently utilized by Sanford's networks. And again, I think it's an underappreciated aspect of the American Civil War, and it's certainly an underappreciated aspect of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. I want to mention one more operation from the Lincoln years that, again, doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. And in part, I think it doesn't get the attention because it doesn't fit with our standard narrative about Abraham Lincoln. It has certain underhanded elements that don't seem all that Lincolnian. And what I'm talking about is an effort that took place in the spring of 1863 to use covert means to influence the American domestic scene. And, look, that Secret Service fund that was created was designated entirely for foreign purposes. So as those of you who know about the Civil War realize, in the spring of 1863, the Union was in pretty tough shape, the Union cause. The Confederate victory at Chancellorsville, just Lincoln having to go through a succession of generals without finding one that seemed to be willing to fight. And so we're talking just prior to Gettysburg here, where the Union prospects seemed pretty low. What happened was that you had gubernatorial races in two New England states, Connecticut and New Hampshire. And Connecticut in particular was quite vital to the Northern War effort. The Colt Firearms Factory and a number of munitions factories were in Connecticut. The problem for the Lincoln administration was that there was a Democratic candidate running for governor of Connecticut that year who was hinting at the possibility of pulling his state out of the war effort. And of course, this would have been a disaster for the Lincoln administration, and who knows, might have even set off a ripple effect in a nation that was in the North that was growing tired of war. And so we know for a fact that William Seward and a political operative of Seward and Lincoln's known as Thurlow Weed met with the president sometime in February or March of 1863 and decided that something extraordinarily needed to be done to influence the gubernatorial race, particularly in Connecticut. And we know that President Lincoln believed that he could not use this Secret Service fund, which was strictly designated for foreign operations. So what the administration did was turn to wealthy Republican donors, particularly in New York City, to run a sort of private covert operation designed to make sure that the right, quote unquote, candidate won the governor's race in Connecticut. In other words, the Republican candidate. And from this point, the trail gets quite murky, but I'm convinced that the money that was raised from these wealthy New York Republican donors was used to bribe election officials in Connecticut to shift the election in favor of the Republican candidate, which is exactly what happened. The Republican candidate won a narrow victory in spite of the fact that a lot of people had assumed in the weeks leading up to the election that the Democratic peace candidate was likely to win. So I'm pointing that example out to you as perhaps an example of where these kinds of presidentially sponsored clandestine operations, particularly if they're turned inward, can become problematic, to say the least. Let me conclude my prepared remarks because I want to get to your questions by just noting by the time the American Civil War draws to an end, and by the time the United States emerges as the world's largest economy during the so-called Gilded Age of the 1880s and 90s, the United States, and in particular, the office of the presidency, has become almost a power unto itself. The presidency has become a power unto itself, almost entirely free of any congressional checks in terms of the use of these kinds of clandestine operations. And so the last thing I'll say in my prepared remarks is I frequently hear people say that it's in the 20th century that we see a kind of imperial presidency free from a lot of congressional oversight, particularly in this kind of secret realm. And what I'm trying to say to you tonight is the roots of that go far deeper and far beyond the 20th century. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Knott, thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks and commentary. I want to clarify, before I open up the floor, I just wanted to clarify. Now, your remarks, is based on your own independent research, or is this actually a part of a course you teach at the Naval War College for the students, I guess, for mid-grade and senior level officers?
So I have taught this, George, in an elective on occasion. Okay. It's been a while now, but I used to teach a course called the National Security Constitution. So it's both a combination of research and writing that I've done, but I have used these materials at the War College. Right,
because since, obviously since we're, I'm reading between the lines of a lot of what you said, and I'm trying to look for corollary to today's, obviously we educate, or the college is missing to educate and develop the future leaders. So I'm wondering what were the terminal objectives, or what were the learning objectives of this course, perhaps the elective, that you would want a mid-grade senior level officers going out to take with them? How does that help frame up their strategic and operational thought process moving forward?
Well, George, I hope, so one of the things I try to always convey to my students when I talk particularly about these founding era, early republic, this history, is that a lot of the issues that you and I confront, both as American citizens, but also my students as military officers, a lot of this is not new. These tensions between Congress and the executive branch, the occasional lack of what I would consider to be a healthy level of congressional oversight of the executive branch. I always make the point of trying to tie these things to the contemporary scene. Now, to the extent to which I succeed, I'm not sure. I hope I do. I tend to get decent evaluations. But I guess as informed citizens and as informed members of the military, I always think it's important to have a strong grounding in American history, and particularly to have a strong grounding in sort of the permanent constitutional questions that arise, not only about the conventional uses of force, but covert or clandestine uses of force.
Yeah, I mean, I always marvel at, as we look back at history, if I hear presentations such as yours that have a very heavy historic context to it, and then I look at today, of course, or in the future and where it's going, and it's remarkable how similarities there are, right?
Right.
But those who don't know history, right, are destined to repeat it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But I appreciate it, and it rings true, I think, at least in my mind, as I see what's going on in the world today. But interesting enough too, before I open the, again, I know you mentioned, clandestine operations, covert operations, sabotage, and bribery. I wonder what does that say for the future of a disinformation campaign, either with our adversaries or with our partners and allies and our adversaries? I mean, where stop, I guess.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part, George.
So where might that stop?
Where might that stop? Yeah. Look, one of the things that I've been disturbed by, at least in recent years, is the extent to which some of our adversaries, or maybe we call them former adversaries who might become future adversaries, have really capitalized on disinformation campaigns inside the United States. And of course, we have a First Amendment. We have a technology that allows us to do the kind of stuff we're doing tonight. The ease with which they can do that through social media is apparent to all of us. So I do think, from my perspective, the United States has to engage in, this is my opinion, similar types of operations. We do so, I know we do, but perhaps we could do a more assertive job in getting the word out about the benefits of the kind of liberal democracy that you and I enjoy the privilege of living in. I have a sense, as an outside observer, that perhaps we're losing that battle at the moment, but I'm not somebody who's opposed to the use. I mean, it's a little touchier when you talk about disinformation, explicit lying. That's okay, maybe in a separate category. But I certainly think the United States has a lot to say and positive about itself. We could be doing a better job getting that message out. And of course, in times of wartime, I have no problem whatsoever in terms of using disinformation. So I guess I'd leave it at that, George.
Right. No, it makes perfect sense to me. Control those who can control the information, I think, certainly have the leverage to succeed in the battle. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to open up the floor for questions. As mentioned previously, please submit questions via the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I think Leonard Olson might have submitted one concerning this. This presentation might be available after it concludes. We post most of these on our website at nwcfoundation.org over under events, and you can find them there. This presentation, obviously, and others. But I guess until I see perhaps a question come through, and I hope I'm looking at the right box too. But the leadership and public opinions piece that you mentioned, Dr. Knott, was an interesting piece, right? So not only do you have to be able to influence the leadership, but public opinion, and sometimes you can use different methods in which to do that. Do you have any comments about how effective you can be, either one or the other, or both?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, George, and obviously those are two very different audiences. Thinking particularly about the American Civil War, as I said, particularly with the public in Great Britain and in France, the Union agents, this Sanford network, settled on slavery as the ace in the hole, as the card to play. And it proved to be very effective. Part of what the Lincoln administration did was to sponsor visits by American speakers who would talk about the horrors of slavery. And at this time in the 1850s, 1860s, Britain and France, there is a kind of incipient union movement taking place. And those union movements within the public were very, for obvious reasons, hostile to the institution of slavery. So I would say the slavery card was the one. I hate to sound cynical because obviously, slavery was an abhorrent practice. So don't get me wrong. But the slavery card at the public level was played well by the Lincoln administration. Amongst the sort of power brokers in the capitals of Europe, it was less slavery and more sort of strategic power politics. The United States was, the Union, the North, was, in terms of its industrial output, of more concern, of greater concern to the powers that be in Europe than the Southern cotton supply. There were alternatives to the Southern cotton supply. The Union market, the Northern market, was bigger. It was more industrial. It was more commercial across the board. And so there was more of a tendency in these elite circles to play a strategic economic or strategic military card. So for instance, just to give you another example, the United States historically, right up to the War of 1812 and even after, had its eyes on Canada for some time. As late as the 1840s, there's still plenty of Americans talking about trying to acquire Canada. The Lincoln administration does its very best to assure Great Britain that American designs on Canada are going to be a thing of the past. And so again, it's a strategic, military, diplomatic, economic card at the elite level, more of an emotional or a passionate appeal at the public level in terms of the horrors of slavery. And so maybe there are some lessons there for contemporary policymakers that you do have to think about the approach you take when you engage in both overt and covert propaganda efforts.
Sure. Yeah, well, makes sense. Thank you. From John Rogard, were there presidential clandestine operations targeting Spanish Cuba through the 19th century?
Great question. Terrific question. Let me start by saying Cuba, from the Jefferson administration up through that of James Buchanan. So we're talking a good 50 years, 1801 to 1861. Was a target of American foreign policy. In other words, particularly amongst Democratic presidents, Jefferson, Jackson, Polk, Buchanan, Pierce, Cuba was considered the jewel in the crown. And if those presidents could have waved a magic wand and acquired Cuba, they would have done it in an instance. And the problem was that Northerners, once slavery begins to become a divisive American issue very early on in the history of the Republic, Northern senators, Northern members of the House were opposed to any acquisitions that would expand the empire of slavery. So as much as those Democratic presidents wanted to acquire Cuba, the Federalists early on, followed by their successors, the Whigs, tended to be opposed to the acquisition of Cuba because it would expand the slave empire. Now, specifically speaking or regarding covert means, it's particularly in the 1850s, and especially under President Franklin Pierce, that a number of private clandestine efforts are made to sort of try to topple Spanish authority in Cuba. The Pierce administration insisted they had no connection with these efforts. And the term applied to these private efforts was filibusterers. So don't associate with the filibuster that we think today, but these private efforts were called filibusterers. The Pierce administration said they had nothing to do with them. There is some evidence to raise some doubts about those denials. But to get back directly to the question, there's not a lot of evidence of direct presidential clandestine involvement in Cuba. However, most of those presidents, the Democratic ones, would have loved to acquire it and would have had it not been for the opposition of the anti-slavery forces at home. Terrific question.
Yeah, very good. From Barbara Sood, I'm not sure I'm tracking the question, but she says, did Congress get wind of these covert activities at all and for more information?
Excellent question. And it's amazing the extent to which Congress was cut out of the loop during the period that I covered tonight. On occasion, Congress would pick up rumors. So for instance, I mentioned the attempt to acquire the Florida Peninsula. That became an open secret, even though it was supposed to be a clandestine operation. And of course, members of Congress, especially from the North, were very suspicious about potential involvement of the Madison administration and attempted to pursue through their congressional hearings and so forth, whether the administration was involved. As I quickly mentioned in my talk, the Madison administration was successful at stonewalling those inquiries. They offered deceptive accounts. They denied any direct involvement. They lied to the Spanish ambassador about American involvement. And the amazing thing, the questioner is onto something important. The amazing thing throughout this period is that Congress kept refinancing, reauthorizing, this contingency fund or Secret Service fund, even though on occasion they had questions about how it was being used. And they never sort of took it to the mat and demanded that American presidents pony up with the facts. And this is why I'm very skeptical of those historians and political scientists who try to argue that the imperial presidency is a 20th century phenomenon. I see the roots of it quite early on. And if I could add, George, just quickly in response to the question, there was another clandestine operation directed domestically by an American president. He's not particularly well known, but John Tyler, through his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, a much more notable figure, did conduct a covert operation against the citizens of Maine in the 1840s, early 1840s, when Britain and the United States almost went to war over the border between Maine and Canada. And Tyler was determined to avoid that war and actually authorized Secret Service funds to try to convince the people of Maine to cool it and to accept a border solution that may not have satisfied most of them. And it worked. But again, the point is that Secret Service fund was not supposed to be used for domestic purposes. And here Congress got wind of it and once again rolled over. And so the congressional oversight in the 19th century, you think there may be weaknesses to it today. It was nothing compared to the weaknesses that exist in the 19th century.
Wow. From Waldemar Scotsko, more of a statement rather than a question, but what's remarkable is not what Washington, Jefferson, and Madison did in the covert realm, but how quickly they learned to play this game effectively with the major powers, France, Britain, who had been engaged in covert action for a long time. The lesson for current times is how this has remained part of statecraft since Sun Tzu.
It's an excellent point. Somebody either teaches in the S&P faculty or is taking the S&P. Yeah, no, look, there's no question that this is the world's second oldest profession, right? To use a crude cliche, these kinds of operations. But the questioner raises an important point. The American founders, at least on paper, considered themselves to be something of a different breed, right? This was a new order for the ages, Novus Ordo Seclorum. We were different. We were going to be set apart from the old world powers. We had this moat called the Atlantic Ocean that was going to allow us to do things differently. And as your questioner noted, very quickly, those who had to sort of make this country a reality and then preserve and protect it, as their presidential oath required, began to realize that while we may be different in terms of being a more democratic political order, if we expected to survive in this international order, we had to engage in some of the same tactics that the old world routinely engaged in. So great point.
Yeah, no, well said. From Mark Wallenweber, are clandestine services necessarily illiberal if they are effective?
Are they necessarily illiberal if they are effective?
Are to be effective.
Are to be effective. That is a tough one. I mean, it does seem to me the kinds of things that I mentioned tonight, and I didn't mention them all. We're talking bribery. I didn't even mention some kidnapping attempts during the revolution that General Washington authorized. No assassination attempts that I was able to discover from this era. But the techniques are certainly not the kinds of ones that one would hope to see, at least practiced within a liberal democratic order. I'm not naive enough to think those kinds of things don't happen. Of course they do. But I'm interested. I'm not sure if your questioner has some alternative means in mind. I can't think of any offhand. Most of what I tend to focus on would be the kinds of things that we would not want to be routinely practiced within the domestic political order.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I always get impressed by our audience and the questions that they pose, and I'm glad you're the one having to answer the question, not necessarily me. But it's
these are great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. From Turner Scott, was the congressional allocation continued at the same original funding level until the Secret Service funds were ultimately terminated, increased by inflation? Where did the Secret Service terminate?
So that Secret Service fund that Washington created and the first Congress approved exists in some form well into the 20th century. It was controlled by the State Department. It loses it ceases to be essentially with the rise of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947 with the National Security Act of 47. I'm sure the State Department still has a contingency fund to deal with short-term things that pop up, probably more traditional diplomatic issues, less covert. But that fund that I talked about is created in 1790 and evaporates in the mid to late, in the late 40s. The funding amount, so it starts at 40,000. During the War of 1812, it's up to 50,000, which may not sound like a great increase, but keep in mind, $50,000 in 1812, again, is still comparable to millions today. And I have to confess, I've lost track of how the sort of ups and downs of the spending requests. But as far as I know, every single president from George Washington up to the early 20th century asks for this fund, requests this fund. I just can't give your questioner a nice, concise, how much dollar figures, other than jumping from 40,000 in 1790 to 50,000 in 1812.
Thank you. From Deborah Lyle, secret societies peaked in 18th and 19th centuries. Men in power, money, religion intertwined. From the Knights Templar to the Freemasons to Skull and Bones have control. Yale with Bush presidencies. Can you touch on the secret societies today and still in control or influence with power?
Well, I mean, I think I would perhaps reject some of the underlying tenets of that question. I don't see these, at least governmental secret funds, in the hands of the Illuminati or the Masons or in the Knights Templar. Although, you know, your questioner is on to something to the extent that, at least in the 20th century, a lot of recruits from the central, before first the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and later the Central Intelligence Agency, tended to be drawn from elite universities, and in particular, Yale University used to be, and Brown in Rhode Island, used to be major recruiting grounds for both the OSS and the CIA. And many of those recruits did have connections to organizations like the Skull and Bones Society, of which George H.W. Bush, future CIA director, future American president, was a member. But again, I guess again, I'd have to say, I'm not quite in agreement with the questioner. I don't see any sort of control. There certainly are tangential connections.
Thank you. From Barbara Sood again, was there an intelligence organization running these operations prior to the war, or was it just handled by a few senior officials?
Great question. There was no, so the first formal American intelligence entities the first one is created in 1882, the Office of Naval Intelligence. Strictly, for the most part, strictly an intelligence gathering entity. And then the Army's Military Information Division 3 years later. Prior to that, in terms of both intelligence gathering and more covert operations, they were run entirely through the State Department. That Secret Service fund that I keep coming back to was under the control of the Secretary of State. It was, and this is an important point, up until the 20th century, most nations did not have a high wall of separation between traditional diplomatic functions and what we would call clandestine operations. They actually tended to merge the two. Today, at least on paper, we try to separate CIA and NSA and all the rest from state and the more traditional. Prior to the 20th century, there's more of a mixing. Again, all of the operations that I talked to you folks tonight about were directed or were approved by American presidents and conducted by the State Department, who usually would not use diplomats, although the Lincoln case is different. They would hire freelance operatives, usually ex-military folks, to run these things. And they would pay them out of this Secret Service fund. So it was a very loose knit. There's not the same bureaucratic structure that we know today. And by the way, this made it, again, more challenging for Congress to get their hands on exactly what was going on, because there was no congressionally authorized bureaucracy running these things. In other words, yes, states are congressionally authorized bureaucracy, but the fund they're dipping into, starting with George Washington, Congress was off limits in terms of how that money was spent. So it made congressional oversight quite challenging. Great question.
Yeah, very good. Thanks. And then just a couple of minutes left from John Rodegard again. And I think you just answered some of this. Were there presidential interactions with the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy's intelligence services? And was the presidency just a consumer of their intelligence, or did they actually direct? And I think you just said they did direct.
Terrific question. And again, so it's not until the 1880s that you begin to see a more, well, let me retract that. Obviously, the American military during particularly the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, McClellan had the Pinkerton Detective Agency at his side providing intelligence. So there were certainly connections between the military and various intelligence and spying. But again, in terms of bureaucratization and direct reporting lines of some sort up through into the White House, it's really, the 1880s is where you begin to see this country take its first steps towards really institutionalizing the notion of intelligence gathering. Again, the Navy taking the lead here with ONI in 1882 under President, hardly a household name, Chester Arthur. And then, of course, in the 20th century, the military becomes the largest consumer, the largest, how many, I think there are, within the Pentagon today, there are just enormous amounts of each service has its own intelligence entities, et cetera. So most of what I've talked to you folks tonight about, again, predates this bureaucratization. And it has a much more freelance, ad hoc quality to it, which is the exact opposite of bureaucratization. I hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful. Dr. Knott, thank you again for your time this evening. It was truly an honor and a privilege to host you this evening, speak about a very interesting topic, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us this evening. And thanks for your membership as well.
Thank you, George. It was a privilege. And thank you all for the terrific questions. I really enjoyed it.
Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's lecture. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, January 19th, the new year, by Dr. Hank Brightman, who will speak to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. Updates to this presentation and others are posted on our page, again, at nwcfoundation.org/our-events. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, all of you, for your continued support of the missions of the U.S. Naval War College Foundation. As the end of the fiscal year approaches, we are still working hard to generate the resources required by the college and the foundation to educate and inform today's decision makers and tomorrow's leaders. Your support and very tax-deductible contributions are an investment in their learning, in our national security, and your continued support is very much appreciated. The Naval War College Foundation trustees and staff are working hard to expand membership and raise awareness of the great institution, which is the U.S. Naval War College. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're already a Naval War College member and still need to get that perfect holiday gift for a family member or a close friend, please consider a gift of membership this holiday season to those who may share your interests and concerns for our national security. You can contact my staff directly for assistance or simply visit our website and start membership. Thank you again for making 2021 a success. Happy holidays and all the very best to you and yours in 2020. Have a great rest of your evening and stay safe.